Namaste and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth, the study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, or mythology, which means science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. And thank you for all the support and love that you have shown us. You have crossed the 75,000 subscriber mark despite having very academic content and referenceable content. We can go and watch our videos 100 times and you'll see some new information you're going to gain. And also to all one of my favorite guests who come on the show, and give a shout out to Professor Kusumlok Akedia and Dr. Ankit Shah and many others who have made this channel very successful, and my friends Vibhuti Jha and many people who have made this channel a great success now. So I have a very special guest joining all the way from Sydney, and my new book, The Original Atlas, has the original name of Australia Island, according to Vedas. It's called Shalmali Dweep, according to Vedic knowledge. And so it has a deep connections with, obviously, one culture at that time, across the world, same culture. Shalmali Dweep. So from Shalmali Dweep and Sydney City, I have Salvatore Babones. Welcome, Salvatore.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. And depending how old you think the Vedas are, Australia may not have been an island at the time. So make sure you check your geography.
well, I don't believe in that continent colliding theory in any way. I have always doubted that theory that one continent sliding.
No. Sea level rise, documented sea level rise around 10,000 BC.
I agree. Sea level rise, I agree.
Before 10,000 BC, Australia was not an island.
Yeah. I hope so. I mean, I think so. So, but it's a beautiful continent, no doubt about it. Beautiful continent, a lot of things on the east coast and west coast to see. And people may not understand, it's a very big island, very big island.
Australia is about the size of the continental United States. So most people have a pretty good idea of what the lower 48 as we call them, look like on a map. Australia is almost exactly the same size as the lower 48 United States.
So that means it's smaller than Brazil. Brazil is bigger than the continental United States. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know the comparison exactly. Yes. It's roughly similar. The difference is that Australia only has 25 million people. So if you imagine it, it's roughly the population of Texas spread across the size of the lower 48 United States. And if you imagine that West Texas feels pretty empty, the Wild West and big, wide open horizons, and imagine that if you're in West Texas, then you're looking at a completely open horizon from there to Portland, Oregon, or from there to Portland, Maine. Either way, it's an incredibly underpopulated continent, sparsely populated, let's say, continent.
So you need to get some more immigrants from West Asia. Would you take them?
Well, immigration is an enormous trend in Australia. Australia is roughly 30% foreign-born, which is the most foreign-born of any major settled country. I mean, there are places that don't give citizenship. So places like Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Singapore or Luxembourg that are more foreign-born. But among places where you can actually have a pathway to citizenship, Australia is the most foreign-born country in the world. That's 30%, which compares to 20% roughly in Canada. I don't know the latest statistics. 15% foreign-born in the United States. Australia is twice as foreign-born as those countries, as the United States. So it really is a big immigration story and has been really since the post-war era, since the 1960s. Australia has been an immigration economy, as I called it in one article.
So would you take people from West Asia today?
People come to Australia from all over. There is a large Muslim minority population, mainly from Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, who are in Australia. And there have been protests against Australia's endorsement of the Israeli government, or Australia standing by the Israeli government. And in fact, the current party in government in Australia, the Labour Party, led by Anthony Albanese, has had a bit of a revolt because it has had two of its Muslim frontbenchers, that is, cabinet ministers, have openly condemned Israel in contravention to the government's own policy, to say nothing of many backbenchers. And I have to add, this is not necessarily simply among Muslim immigrants. There's a very strong streak of anti-Semitism among Australia's white elite that comes out in places like the Greens Party or the left of the Labour Party or the union movement. I myself just this week resigned from my own union because in protest at the union's support for Hamas-linked charities. So, Australia does accept a lot of Muslim Middle Eastern immigration. Whether it will continue to do so, I suspect that won't be an issue because Australia is very points-based and transparent in its immigration procedures, and it's not country-specific. But of course, it has been a problem. It has been, a lack of integration among relatively poorer, relatively less educated Muslim immigrants on the fringes of our capital cities, have taken positions that most Australians simply find abhorrent about the violence that Hamas has inflicted on Israel.
So coming to, I like Australia a lot. I've been to Australia many times for businesses and anything else. One thing I really, in my last book, Gold, Glory and God, I touched upon the condition of Aborigines and many Aboriginal leaders also. But I must congratulate you also that on your constitution, you have given more rights than any other colonized country in the world to to natives of Australia. That I must say. And
so forgive my saying that's true and not true. Also, I should be very clear. I'm not Australian. So I'm American. I've lived in Australia for 15 years. No, but you said you have given, and I just want to make clear to the audience that I'm not Australian. So I speak about Australia as an observer who's right there on the ground, an eyewitness observer to Australia, but nonetheless as an observer, not as a participant in Australia. And in many ways, Aboriginal Australians don't have the same recognition that Indigenous peoples have in other countries. And I know we're going to focus on that, but I have a lot of data to bring you on that as we go forward with the conversation.
So can you share, like, how do we compare the rights of Aboriginal Australians? I'm glad I know that you're an American, we are all American.
Right, but the audience may not know.
Audience may not know. Yes. Yeah, I mean, people know, on our channel, people know you. Because so on our channel, they know you. Last time so this video is going to go in the same series as the last one which went. And people know that you are an American living in Australia, teaching over there. So can you compare the Aboriginal rights of natives in Australia and Indigenous rights in the United States? And you are from Ohio, I believe. Ohio, right? You saying?
No. I'm born in New Jersey and I've lived around the US, but never in Ohio.
Okay. So so how do you compare the two populations, Native Americans and Aborigines of Australia?
There are very different situations for Indigenous peoples in the United States, who we would call Native American tribes, and in Australia, which are mostly Aboriginal groups, but also a small population of Torres Strait Islanders, that is, people who are not Aboriginal Australians, but from the straits between Australia and New Guinea, and who have more in common linguistically and ethnically with people from New Guinea. The situations are very different. The only thing they really have in common is that they're both Indigenous peoples. In the United States, there were a series of Indian wars, and most of us have seen cowboy and Indian movies, that make this very clear. But there were a series of Indian wars throughout U.S. history, starting in the 17th century, at the beginning of settlement. 1620 is when the first permanent settlements occurred in the United States. 1619, I'm sorry, when the first permanent settlements started in the United States. And so there was conflict throughout, and a series of treaties made throughout. Now, sometimes it wasn't conflict. In New England, when the first Pilgrim settlers settled in Massachusetts, settled in Massachusetts, there was no conflict between settlers and Native Americans. Instead, there were a series of cooperative agreements reflected in our Thanksgiving ceremony. Our Thanksgiving holiday is a ceremony celebrating the friendship between Native Americans and settlers. But that recognition that American Indians were organized political entities began right from the beginning, with English settlers making treaties, alliances, and wars against Native Americans, whereas in Australia, there was a much more peaceful process of settlement. There was violence on the frontier, but it was low-level, household-level violence, not organized warfare between organized groups. But not only was there less violence in Australia, there was not a recognition among the English settlers of Australia that Aboriginal Australians formed discrete political entities. The result is that in the United States, there are a series of treaties, I mean, literal international treaties between the government of the United States and before that, the governments of the colonies that became the United States and Native American tribes, which have a corporate identity. They're called domestic dependent nations, meaning that they have a form of quasi-sovereignty within the United States. They all are required to have democratic procedures. They elect their own leaders. In some cases, they have their own sheriffs and police forces. In some cases, they run their own schools. And they run tribal governments over land that is their sovereign or semi-sovereign land. And when I say sovereign, what I mean is that they have a sovereignty akin to that of a state in the United States. They are not sovereign as nations, so they're called dependent nations. They can't make treaties with Canada or treaties with Mexico. They don't have international relations. But within the United States, they have their own institutions. That is completely lacking in Australia, or at least until recently was completely lacking. There are some institutions in Australia called land councils that manage Aboriginal land. Those have only come into existence in the last 30 years. But those land councils have very weak institutions compared to the Native American ones. And crucially, the land councils in Australia, for the most part, are not based on a discrete tribal identity. That is, a land council covers an area of land. So the New South Wales Land Council, the Greater Sydney Land Council here in New South Wales covers an area of land, and all Aboriginal people who happen to be in that area can participate in the land council, regardless of what language their ancestors spoke or what nation they claim to belong to. Right? So there aren't these national or proto-national institutions in Australia the way there are in the United States. On the other hand, in Australia, there is I think, a much higher level of government spending on Indigenous programs and on welfare for Indigenous people. In the United States, Native American tribes they can tax their own members to pay for public services. They also get lots of money from government to provide public services, but it's actual service money. That is, if the Native American tribe is going to run a school, the state government gives them the school budget to manage, the same way they would give a school budget to any other school. But they also have taxes. They also raise their own money. In Australia, there is a much more generous set of programs specifically targeted towards Indigenous people. So, of course, Indigenous people in Australia can attend school just like anyone else. They vote just like anyone else. They can have all the rights and duties of citizens just like anyone else. But there are also a lot of targeted government spending programs towards aiding Indigenous people. And a major complaint, and I'll just wrap up here, is that much of the money from those programs goes to support an Indigenous bureaucracy in Canberra, in the capital, as opposed to being spent in the field helping actual Indigenous people. And that's one of the main fault lines here in Australia.
No, in USA, a lot of work has been done in terms of helping the Native Americans. I must agree there also, because during my recent book research, I found out many Native American places are still intact, but the encroachment, the legal encroachment, is also very severe. The reservations have been put into places where it's a very barren land. Yeah. And so it's like it doesn't make any sense, especially in California or central in the Midwest and other places, uninhabitable places. Now, if you look at states like Oklahoma, Alabama, and other states on the southwestern side, there is a very good work. In fact, Congressman Mark Twain Mullin, very good friend of mine in Oklahoma, I must congratulate him what he has done for the Native Americans over there. But a lot more needs to be done, because there is a lot of integration being done in the US, and a lot of earmarks are kept for them, but most of them are spent in something else other than reaching the Native American community. And in USA, I can say that most of the money doesn't reach them. South Dakota, North Dakota, and also the church groups have infiltrated them, destroyed their original religion, culture, languages to large extent. So now most of them have mixed names like John and Whitefeather, like something like that. Imagine
Well,
just thinking of the names.
like every liberal country, the United States has freedom of religion, and if people choose to become religious, that's their choice. So I don't think we can, I think it's too easy to romanticize Indigenous people by insisting that they remain separate and maintain what we consider to be their culture. Yet, I know this may not be true in India, but in the United States, it's true that every one of our ancestors who is Christian converted to Christianity at some point, right? There's nobody who is originally Christian because before year zero, there were no Christians. Okay. So, everybody or their ancestors at some point in the United States, I know Hinduism is a very different situation as an organic religion that has no beginning point. But, the idea that people can freely choose their religion is something that's deeply embedded in American society, as it is in Australian society. It applies to Indigenous people as much as to anyone else. I'll just give one example here in Australia. The La Perouse Indigenous people, the Aboriginal people here, they're in South Sydney. They're near Botany Bay, which is the very first point of contact between Captain Cook and the Indigenous people here in 17... Australians, forgive me. I'm remembering 1792, but that may not be correct. When the first fleet originally came. Their top priority, their top funding priority for fundraising is to restore their mission church on their lands. Now, as an outsider, it's not for me to say they're somehow betraying themselves by wanting to restore their church instead of restore some other Aboriginal practice. I mean, how can I say, if we really believe in sovereignty, then Indigenous sovereignty, then we believe in the rights of Indigenous people if they want to take a religion.
Yeah, even in the US, my proposal to the US congressmen and senators, why not teach Native American culture, religion also as a subject, as an elective in the mainstream books? Because that will be like giving an equal opportunity, because now there is a majority of the church and Christian groups in the country, and obviously they have more power. Why not the Indigenous cultures also be given funding so they can introduce their own language, their culture, their religion to Americans, to other Christians also. They should also learn about them. And in my research and study, I found the Sanatan Dharma culture and Native American practices are very similar in many ways. One God, universal God, nature, and all those things are very common. And in fact, I'll have some of my friends who are watching right now or who will watch right now that I'd like to say, because when I participated in them in the lodges, sweat lodges, which are illegal nowadays for many reasons, many states, but I did that in West Virginia, and I could see what they're doing is very similar to any Vedic ritual around fire, very similar. Now, coming back to Australia as an observer, now I know you are an observer.
Yes.
So when you say voice vote, which happened recently, and it was defeated actually. So who lost actually, according to you?
What lost? So there was a vote last weekend in Australia on a constitutional amendment proposal to create a new chapter in Australia's constitution that would establish an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. This would be a new consultative organization. I want to be clear, this would not have been a sovereign body like a Native American tribe, or quasi-sovereign body like a Native American tribe, or like the Sami parliament in Norway or the Sami parliament in Finland. Instead, this would have created a consultative body with an not specified membership mechanism to express views on any issue it chose to the parliament, which was non-controversial, and to executive government, which was highly controversial. This amendment was in many ways largely symbolic in that it didn't have any content about what the voice would do. It merely directed Parliament to establish a voice, and there was already a majority in Parliament in favor of establishing an Indigenous voice. So there was no need for a constitutional amendment. People say that by having it in the Constitution, Parliament could never eliminate it. That is technically true. But Parliament could have gutted it at any time if it wanted, simply by saying, passing a law saying the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice shall be embedded in the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. And that would be legal. Parliament had the authority under the constitutional amendment to define membership in the voice. Okay, so the voice was in many ways purely symbolic in that it simply directed Parliament to do what Parliament could do anyway. But in other ways, it left things open for a long sequence in the future of legal challenges because of one very specific item in the constitutional amendment, which was that the voice could make representations to Parliament, and 3 words, and executive government. And that was not defined. And so the challenge there would be, so for example, some of the voice activists said that the voice could challenge Australia's participation in the AUKUS alliance. And you might say, well, that has nothing to do with Indigenous people, but of course, a clever lawyer can always find a link. AUKUS might do exercises on Aboriginal land, or money that goes to an AUKUS submarine might be taken away from Aboriginal programs, right? So you can always draw a link, however tenuous. And so the question was, would executive government, would the governance of Australia be forever bogged down by every government decision, every sighting of a post office, have someone saying, well, you haven't consulted the voice about that. And we have the voice has a constitutional right to be consulted. So that was really the core of the legally controversial part of the voice. Okay. Now, one thing the voice would not have done, ironically, is create a voice for Aboriginal people, which is to say the design committee for the voice at no point envisaged, and they had I think it was around a 70-page document on the proposed structure of the voice. At no point did they envisage that Aboriginal people would be able to vote for their representatives. Instead, the idea seems to have been all along that peak Aboriginal bodies, so groups that, Aboriginal health groups, Aboriginal sovereignty groups, Aboriginal economic empowerment groups, all of these NGOs would get together and decide who would be on the voice. So the voice was a mechanism to represent elite Aboriginal opinion reflected in these Aboriginal organizations, most of which survive entirely on government funding. It would not have been an open electoral voice that Aboriginal people could express their dissatisfaction with their leaders. And for someone like me, who believes that the core of what democracy means is the consent of the governed, can the governed get rid of someone they don't want representing them? The voice would not have provided that mechanism for Aboriginal Australians. Okay, so I think there's been a lot of mythology around the voice. On the one side, saying that the voice would finally give recognition to Aboriginal people. I think it would not have done so. But on the other hand, people against the voice saying the voice would create a new third arm of government that would be co-equal with Parliament and the executive. Again, that's also not true. It was a largely symbolic measure that, however, unfortunately, was not construed as a democratic institution.
Don't you think the Australian politics is copying the American politics? Make America great again, make Australia great again. Do you think that is also resounding right now? Because I was listening to Sky News, which is a very conservative channel in US,
Right.
in Australia.
Yes.
And their anchors were pretty much looking very happy that the
Yes.
voice was defeated. And I did not see an alternative. I think ABC is an alternative one. And they were very sad on the whole show I was watching. It was like a big loss for them. And Prime Minister Albanese also had a big loss on
Yes.
like a big loss for them. I like him very much, actually. What he has done for the people, I like what he does. Now, my question to you is, the conservative, which is mostly Christian, hardly very Christian Australian groups and evangelical groups, and do they accept the right of Aborigine of Australia and Maoris also of New Zealand, because New Zealand usually copies the Australian politics many ways. So do you think that they will ever accept a Aborigines' right to self-rule?
So first, I would caution you against generalizing from your U.S. experience to Australia. The fault lines in politics are very different here. There's no such thing as a rhetoric of Australia first that doesn't exist. I also remind you that in watching Sky News, you're watching a subscription satellite channel, whereas most Australians will be watching terrestrial television. Now, here in Australia, every major institution, and I must stress this, every major institution in Australia either endorsed The Voice or took no position on The Voice. The only institution that opposed The Voice was the Liberal Party itself, that is the current opposition party, the more conservative party in Australia's system. Australia has two major parties, Liberal and Labour. Labour is in power right now, and Labour promoted The Voice. And the Liberal Party only half-heartedly opposed The Voice, by which I mean the Liberal leader opposed The Voice, but the Liberal Indigenous Affairs Minister actually resigned over that. That is, there was not a consensus in the Liberal Party to oppose The Voice. Every other major institution supported The Voice. Even Rupert Murdoch-owned outlets like the Australian newspaper, the largest national newspaper in Australia, the Australian tried to be balanced, so half pro, half against, despite the fact that their readership was overwhelmingly against. Sky News was mostly against, but again, Sky News is a satellite channel. If you go to the terrestrial channels, all of them supported The Voice. If you go to the other non-Murdoch-owned newspapers, all of them supported The Voice. And it's interesting you mentioned the ABC. So you said you're watching ABC coverage, Australian Broadcasting Corporation. The ABC is supposed to take no position on things because it is a publicly funded public broadcaster. Yet it was clear to everybody that the ABC was very sympathetic to The Voice and only gave token acknowledgement to any anti-Voice campaign. Now, when I say that's the media, Qantas, the national airline, very controversially painted many of its airplanes with pro-Voice, vote yes painting on the side of the planes. Other large companies gave literally millions of dollars, and I say literally gave millions of dollars to the pro-yes, pro-Voice campaign. The pro-Voice campaign was extraordinarily better funded, something like by a ratio of 50 million to 2 million than the anti-Voice campaign. Even cities in states where it was allowed, cities used public money to campaign for the yes campaign. And that includes both the city of Sydney and the city of Melbourne. Both of these major cities in Australia ran publicly funded advertisements, not informing people, but encouraging people to vote yes. So I really have to warn you against generalizing from the U.S. experience. In Australia, every institution in Australia, with the qualified exception of Sky News, took a pro-Voice approach, but that in a context where the anti-Voice vote won by a 60-40 margin. It wasn't a close vote. It was 60 against 44. The anti-Voice vote won in all 6 states in Australia by a large margin. It won in the Northern Territory. The only place it lost was the Australian Capital Territory around Canberra, in which more than half the population is either public servants or lives in a household with a public servant. They voted against The Voice. So it was a widely popular vote to oppose The Voice. And I want to remind people, Australia is not such a Christian nation as the US. I mean, first of all, the establishment churches here are the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. Evangelicals in Australia are a relatively small population compared to Catholics and Anglicans. The Anglican Church, I don't know if they took an institutional position. Most Anglican churches campaigned for The Voice. That is, any Anglican church you drove by would have a pro-Voice billboard up on the side of the church. The Catholic Church institutionally took no position on The Voice, but they didn't campaign against it. So there may have been some evangelicals in Australia who opposed The Voice, but that's only, evangelicals only constitute 5 to 10% of the population in Australia. It's a very different religious mix from that in the United States.
So now, with this Voice vote being defeated, and you clearly mentioned that even if it would have passed, won't have made much difference because the executive powers and other laws of Australia have already tackled those issues. So it won't have made much difference. But then why was a complaint or kind of a opposition point was anti-voice vote program was that it's going to have a dialogue between an Aboriginal state, establish a two-state system, Aboriginal state versus
Yeah.
this state. Why was that fear then in the first place?
Well, political campaigns thrive on fear, and that simply wasn't true. That is, the proposals for Aboriginal sovereignty in the Voice Amendment were much more mild than the kinds of Aboriginal sovereignty Indigenous sovereignty that actually exist in the United States, in Canada, in Norway, in Finland, and in New Zealand. In all of those countries, there are much more robust Indigenous representative institutions. And indeed, even in Australia, the Aboriginal population does not have a voice. Torres Strait Islanders actually have a voice. There's a Torres Strait Islands Commission. They're only, I think, forgive me if I get the number wrong, I believe there are only about 30,000 Torres Strait Islanders. It's a very small population in the straits between Australia and Papua New Guinea. But they have their own commission, which is popularly elected, which can make representations to Parliament and can make representations to executive government. And they do all these things. So even in Australia, there's a model already running for a democratically constituted Indigenous voice. The current voice proposal would have only created an essentially appointed advisory body. So the fear stoking from the No campaign around sovereignty, I think, was really misplaced. That said, much of that fear stoking was concerned with what would evolve in the future. That is, once this institution was created, their fear was, what would it turn into? What would it become? But I think their raising the issue of sovereignty was completely off base, because this would not have created any kind of sovereign or semi-sovereign institution. Now, I say that as someone who would support a sovereign institution. And in fact, some of the more extreme supporters of Aboriginal sovereignty in Australia campaigned against the voice precisely because they felt it did not give them any kind of sovereign institutions.
No, many Christianism-based movements in North America, and I would not like to disrespect Australian brothers and sisters, actually. Many of my Australian friends over there. Christianism movements in USA have consistently, like if you look at the 12 missions of California, and Junipero Serra set up, have destroyed Native Americans' rights, and those have not been investigated yet. And Governor Gavin Newsom has apologized for atrocities against the Native American children and other things. He has done that. He may not be very popular amongst the Indian American community, but he has done a good work, actually. We must appreciate what he has done. In the case of Canada, we have seen all the graves being coming up in the name of Catholicism and other things, and they have unearthed all these graves. In Australia also, there were many incidents like that. These have been recorded and they have been published. Many things I have quoted also in my books also. I won't quote them here. Readers can read my books on that. But do you think that this kind of system, I mean, you actually clarified also, Australia is not as religious as United States or any other in the North American, South American continents also. In that they are far more religious in terms of Christianism based. So was there a fear in the minds of Aborigines for so long that Australia has been an independent country? Still it carries the symbol of crown on their coins, and they've not removed it. They're trying to, but they have not removed it.
Right.
Was there a fear that this kind of incident with the rising religion-based fanaticism across the world, not just in Australia, it may happen that this fear of Christianism is going to rise more, and it's going to more destroy Aboriginal faiths? Because
Right.
I was searching on the Google Maps and places, there is not a single place of Aboriginal worship exists in Australia today. I mean, that's a fact.
Right.
So what
So
do you
for-
have to say on that?
Yeah, so first, just to debunk something, I think there has been no evidence presented of mass graves connected with Canadian Christian schools and organizations. My own view is that that's all been a hoax. We could debate that if you want, but no graves have actually been exhumed. There have been claims that graves exist in mass numbers, but we haven't seen any evidence that that's actually true. I personally doubt that it's true. When we get to the schools, this has been a longstanding controversy because well-meaning people who have wanted to improve lives for Indigenous people in Australia, the US, and Canada established the schools that are now vilified as having been genocidal for attempting to bring Indigenous people out of their culture and into mainstream society. However, the people who did them then viewed it as a liberal reform to improve lives for Aboriginal people. I'm not sure that what we think today are liberal reforms will necessarily be viewed well in the future. The problem here is the lack of Aboriginal or Indigenous institutions. So, for example, in the United States, where Native American tribes often run their own schools, it's up to them. Do they want to teach Native American languages? Then they can. If they choose not to teach Native American languages and focus on English, they can choose to do that. If they want to have a religious education component, in the US, it's more complicated to be able to do it, but they can certainly have a cultural education component in their schools. Or put differently, if a Native American tribe in the United States wants to grant land for the establishment of religious institutions and people choose to build churches on that land, again, that's a choice that the Indigenous people themselves make. And I think we who are non-Indigenous really have to respect that if we believe in Indigenous sovereignty, if we believe in Indigenous people, that they should be able to establish their own institutions. And if what they want are Christian institutions, that's their own business. That said, in Australia, there are not these mechanisms for Indigenous governance. In Australia, Indigenous people are largely governed directly from Canberra, that is directly by the state. They don't have their own quasi-sovereign institutions to be able to make decisions for themselves in a democratic and transparent way. And I think that's really the challenge here. Now, as for there being no Aboriginal religious institutions, Aboriginal religion wasn't conducted within institutions. So there were no, as far as we can tell, there were no Aboriginal religious institutions before contact, or certainly not in the early period of colonialism. Why would we expect them now? Now, no one's stopping Aboriginal people from establishing their own institutions. But I think we could and should see a much higher level of government support for a structure of Indigenous self-governance. And I always want to stress, once you have self-governance institutions for groups, well, then it's out of your hands, right? If they don't want to embrace their quote unquote their Indigenous culture, that's up to them, just as much as every country in the world that has sovereignty can decide for itself. Does it want to have English medium instruction or Hindi medium instruction? Well, that's for India to decide. And I, as an outsider, can't tell you, oh, it's a genocide of Indians, the fact that you do your education in English. It's an Indian choice to do education in English. It's not my choice.
I would like to, if any Aboriginal leaders are watching, we would like to support you from USA to establish your own ministries independent of the government. If you want to do that, we'll support you. And also, we'll help you set up that. And the American embassies in Australia will also support that. We'll put a petition there, and we'll see what we can do for you. But so now, from the point of view of state-controlled Indigenous ministries, which I feel that you don't like it because it should be free. Let it go. Let people decide. What do you say?
Well, the question is, do we believe in autonomy and independence and sovereignty? These are words that get thrown around all the time. Well, do we believe in them? If we believe in autonomy or sovereignty, that means, like with children, letting them go, giving them the resources. But in the United States, these are all required to be democratic. In Australia, in some states they are, in some states they're not, but the national constitutive bodies have never been democratic, are not currently democratic. Sovereignty means letting people make decisions for themselves. And we don't have much of that in Australia. Instead, what we have are Indigenous bureaucracies that are funded by the government, that get a lot of input from Indigenous people, but they get input from activist Indigenous people that we don't know actually represents the desires of Indigenous people themselves, because we don't have those formal representative institutions. Instead, everything is done in a less formal manner. Now, on the issue of religion, would Indigenous people want to create religious experiences of their own? It's, again, unlike the situation in the United States. Indigenous religious practice is widely taught in Australian schools. It's extremely fashionable. It's hard to go to a meeting of an organization today, of a major, like let's say an event or a conference, that doesn't open with an Aboriginal smoking ceremony. It's simply become de rigueur to celebrate Indigenous institutions. So that's very unlike the United States, where in many ways the African American, white American divide completely overrides the Indigenous settler divide in the United States. Here, where there's not that heritage of slavery or of anti-African racism, instead the big divide is Indigenous versus settler Australia, with the result that whereas in U.S. schools, there's an extraordinary emphasis today in U.S. schools on teaching of race history and African American history and their African American holidays like Juneteenth and Martin Luther King Day. In Australia, that all of that space is occupied by Indigenous Australia. So there's a celebration of Indigenous culture in schools. There's the proposal to create Indigenous holidays. They don't exist as of this point. There's a vicious national debate over Australia Day and whether it should be celebrated or mourned as Invasion Day. That's a big debate here in Australia. But it's not the same as the United States. There's a lot of Indigenous content. Now, I might question whether it's authentic Indigenous content because it doesn't come from actual Indigenous representative institutions. It comes from NGOs who, let's face it, are ultimately looking to make a buck by selling their curriculum into the schools. And what I think Australia would really benefit from is from having autonomous, representative, democratic, representative institutions for Aboriginal Australians. And I want to be clear, the Australian white establishment does not want that, and the Australian Indigenous establishment does not want that. Because I think both sides fear they don't want to know what Indigenous people might actually vote for if they had the chance to vote for themselves.
No, it all boils down to power. Actually, it all boils into power and the resources, control of resources in any way. So, my question,
the most popular, I have to mention her name. The most popular Indigenous leader in Australia today is a woman named Jacinta Price, who is genetically half Indigenous. Her mother is full Aboriginal. Her name is Bess Price. She was a member of Parliament herself in the past. Her father is, I think, Irish Australian. He's white Australian in any case. Jacinta grew up in Alice Springs in Indigenous communities. She's now a member of Parliament, and she is wildly popular. And she led the No campaign. She was the leader of the No campaign. So what do Indigenous people want? Well, the Indigenous people of her electorate voted for her. Whether Indigenous people around the country would vote for her, I don't know. There are other Indigenous members of Parliament as well. She's not the only one. But as far as the single most prominent, talked about Indigenous person in Australia is actually opposed to the voice, right? But we won't know we'll never know who really has the support of Indigenous people unless there are Indigenous representative organizations built on a democratic base, as there are and I can't stress this enough, every other country that has Indigenous representative institutions, every other developed country, organizes them on a democratic basis.
Some of these colonial practices are still in India also. Many of the Indian temples are controlled by the state, which is also the same problem, because similar problem where why would a state would like to control a Hindu temple? It's a very common problem. In the US, hardly any church is controlled by the state. Hardly
none. Not hardly any, none, zero.
No, there is one.
No, even the National Cathedral is not run by the country. It just calls itself the National Cathedral.
Yeah, but they do receive a lot of grants.
But not for their religious work.
So one last question, actually. So if I were to ask you, or you have better insights, you're living there, you're observing. An observer has more insights than the actually person who are in the fray. So If I were to ask you a question, what changes would you like to see in Australia so that the Aborigines get a similar kind of framework like in the US, independent? At the same time, I don't want them to push into reservations. I want them to live in the mainstream society, live in the mainstream and their culture. And I really like the rugby opening spaces, rugby matches you see, and how they have the war cries over there in the match, before the match. I like that because it's very, very native, very aboriginal. So what can you suggest that these Australian government, and maybe this time they lost the vote, maybe next time they win the vote, what can they do so that the Aboriginal institutions become stronger in Australia?
Well, part of the problem is things have become so politicized that what you just said, as reasonable as it sounds, by some people would be called racist and genocidal, which is, you just said you want Aboriginal people to be part of the mainstream of Australian society. Well, there are a lot of activists who feel like taking Aboriginal people or even enticing them or encouraging them to leave the land is tantamount to genocide. Now, that's a ridiculous claim to make, but it is widely made by top intellectuals and top peak institutions in Australia. And that kind of unreasonableness is a big part of the problem. I think the best thing we could do, any of us could do, for Indigenous people in Australia or anywhere, is to stop saying what would be good for them and let them tell us what would be good for them. And ultimately, that means democratically constituted representative organizations. Of course, I can't speak for what Indigenous people in remote communities want or should have, but neither can a person who is an Indigenous Australian university professor in Canberra speak for what people in remote communities should have. People have to speak for themselves, what they want for themselves in their lives. And the best mechanism the world has ever arrived at for that is representative democracy. Now, there are people who say, mostly Indigenous intellectuals, not people out in the bush, who say that, well, representative democracy is a Western system that has no bearing on traditional Aboriginal governance. And I would say, well, you're right. But traditional Aboriginal forms of governance are really no more moral than traditional European methods of governance, like absolute monarchy, right? Everyone in the modern world has given up traditional mechanisms of governance because we believe that everybody has, and I say this categorically, we in the modern world believe that everybody has the same right to contribute to their own self-governance. If you don't accept that, well, then I don't have anything for you. If you accept that, then I can't say that this highly privileged Aboriginal elder gets to speak for these such and such people because that's their way. No, let's have democratic representative institutions. Native Americans have them. Native Canadians have them. Sami have them. Maori have them. Why can't Torres Strait Islanders have them? Why can't Aboriginal Australians have them? And unfortunately, I think the main block to that is that the existing Aboriginal elite doesn't want the threat to its power. And until they're willing to subject their own ideas to a democratic vote, Australia is not going to make progress.
Absolutely true. Because people, the societies are more open, and Australians are also need to come off the colonialism, because they ran away from UK. Many of them were sent to UK, from UK to Australia. But thank you very much, Salvatore, for coming on the show and putting clear thoughts. And for the first time, your thoughts and my thoughts align here. And we disagree on the content.
Not for the last.
Yes. We disagree on many things, like the continental colliding, we disagree, and all those things we disagree. But at the same time, all of us have to make an effort to preserve original cultures of the land. And in the Vedic world, like you are a student of Vedas, and I have studied a lot of my books only on the Vedas and Puranas. And the name of the land is given on the principal product of that land. So that's why Australia is called Shalmali Dweep, because it's filled with Shalmali, which is a very famous cotton plant available in Australia.
Forgive me for being so impolite as to interrupt your outro, but let me just put one tiny little twist on that, which is that no, we don't need to preserve the indigenous cultures of the land. It's up to indigenous people to decide what they want.
We need to give them the freedom to do that.
Freedom to decide which to do, because my own ancestors long ago decided they didn't want to be Catholic peasants in Sicily. They wanted a different kind of life. And if Aboriginal Australians decide what they want is English language, modern technology, complete integration, more power to them. On the other hand, if what they decide what they want is to preserve ancient institutions, more power to them. They have to decide. It's up to them. I don't want to force them to be a living museum for their culture when I'm not a living museum for mine. Autonomy is what it's, sovereignty is what it's all about. Self-determination is what it's all about. And they deserve as much a right to self-determination as I have.
Absolutely. I totally concur you on that one. And with that pleasant note, and we would like to say, end it in a way that we would like to see Aboriginal Australians to come up, and we want the Australian elites to also understand the need for sovereignty of the local people, because they have the right, as much as you have to practice your religion, they have the right to have freedom for their culture, their religion, and language. Namaste and thank you. Thank you, Salvatore.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.